Thank you very much, Mark. Not only to be here, but the possibility to get CIS, the host institution in Washington, D.C. for more than 5 months. And in general, the topic, I would like to tell that everything you can blame on me, because it was my concept and actually my research topic, which is conducted here in the CIS. And just to shift to the research question and the hypothesis, the main question for me was in the comparison of the US and the European migration crisis, that in the fiscal year of 2022, more than 2 million illegal border crossing happened in the southwest border of the United States, right? In the last year, 2020, in the European Union external borders, not more than 330,000 illegal border crossing happened. So the difference is almost 8 times. And the question for me was that what's the main reason behind this? Because last year was also, let's say, a tragic year in Europe, a huge increase, almost 70% increase in the number of illegal border crossing, and still the numbers are much lower in the European Union. While we can see that Europe actually has more open borders comparing with the United States, many sea borders, which is easy access. We could see how easily and sometimes in a tragic way the Mediterranean can be passed by illegal border crossers. There's a prolonged crisis since 2013, when actually the first the Kosovonian and across the central Mediterranean route, the Africans started to arrive in a big number to the European Union. And there is a huge crisis in the direct European neighborhood, which actually started with the Arab Spring and COVID-19, some state collapse that happens, for example, in Syria and in Libya, but also the food crisis, which is in Africa very, very visible, the inflation, economic wars. And it's also important to underline the lack of consensus between certain EU states. And still, as I mentioned, the number are much lower. And according to my understanding and research, which was also supported my stay and the interviews and the research conducted in DC, is definitely the role of gatekeeper countries in this context. A little bit about conceptual framework, which is of course very boring for ordinary audience, but for us as researchers, was the most important part of the whole study. That in practice and policy, this gatekeeper issue is very old. In the case of the European Union, but it's almost unknown in migration studies and in the whole academic literature. If you try to Google and try to find articles and theoretical background, you can easily find what is not a gatekeeper issue. It's not the gatekeeper states of Africa, which is a much more political term, nothing about migration. It's not Operation Gatekeeper, which perhaps sounds more familiar for the American audience because it was conducted by the United States itself, and even not the role of small EU states within the Schengen zone. What is much more gatekeeper issue is somehow a geographic approach. We can make a distinction, of course, between countries of origin, transit countries, and destination countries. Gatekeeper countries are concentrated on transit routes, as Mark mentioned. So somewhere mid between the countries of origin and countries of destination, even if they can serve as countries of origin. There's a thematic approach. Gatekeeper issues definitely the part of migration critique, migration realist approach, which underline the importance of stop or reduction of the flow of irregular arrivals, which is not natural in all aspects of migration studies, to say at least. It's definitely the part of externalization of migration policy, somehow outsourcing of the combat against illegal migration. And in certain extent, it's also the part of the securitization, because of course who wants to stop illegal migration, consider that the arrival of a huge mass of people is not only an opportunity, for example, the economy, if it's at all, but also demonstrate challenges and threats for the security, as Todd Bensman, argued, for example, in his books, we can say. Yeah, and it's also policy practice, how EU and European states and also the United States started to implement policies in collaboration with third countries to mitigate the flow of illegal migrants. So what we can state that gatekeeper countries are entities which live on the transit routes towards the transit countries toward the destination countries or region. They are relatively closed, or in most cases in the direct neighborhood of destination countries, and they have some capacities and intention to mitigate the flow of illegal mass migration, because there can be states there, but it's almost impossible, to cooperate them if they don't want. They can be also the countries of origin, as I mentioned, but it's not their main characteristics. But the main question, how they can help to stop the flow of third country citizens. And if we have a look at the certain countries in the context of Europe, they are Turkey, Morocco, Libya, Serbia, or even Niger. This is why we should be very cautious when we state that the gatekeeper countries are the direct neighborhoods of certain states. But in the case of the United States, Mexico, Guatemala, actually the Northern Triangle countries. What are the practical considerations, ladies and gentlemen? It's almost impossible to defend just a thin red line on the map. So border protection, physical border barriers are very important and an integral part of any border protection, but only with fences stopping arrival of hundreds of thousands or million people, it's almost impossible. Another important consideration that if people manage to get in the European Union or the United States, after it's almost impossible to somehow relocate them back to third countries or the countries of origin. In the case of EU, it's very evident that independently whether they have any legal background to get any form of protection or refugee status, if you have already in the Schengen zone, you have between 80-85% chance to stay there actually for years, if not forever. Gatekeeper countries can help to outsource long and costly asylum procedures, and it demonstrates a lower expenditure for maintenance. It's easy to realize that maintaining a family in the middle of the United States or in Mexico or in Egypt is much lower, and there are huge differences between them. It's also about and back to the arriving people. It's the part of the deterrence policy, because if there are significant chance that you will be stopped in a transit countries without reaching your destination countries, you will consider twice whether you are paying thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars and euro to leave your country and try to get in a certain other state. There is higher possibility for return because these countries are much closer, and not only geographically, but also in many cases in cultural and social term to the countries of origin. So it's also a possibility for return, which, for example, from the United States or the European Union, it's less and less possibility for this. Also, among the practical consideration is that it's a huge toolkit and very wide to collaborate with states, because in this context, states are negotiating with states, not with NGOs, not with other organizations, which sometimes extremely complicated. And from diplomacy across development assistance, trade, and humanitarian assistance, there are many instruments on the table during these negotiations. In general, there are two possible way and approach for these negotiations. One is the stick and carrot policy, which was very evident in the Migrant Protection Protocols, the remaining Mexico program, offering something and threatening by something. or it was similar also in the EU-Turkey statement, which is, of course, not the nicer way of politics, but sometimes these are the things how it's going, which can be more fruitful, perhaps, and there are more and more examples for this, and which can let somehow a win-win situation is an assistance for the gatekeeper countries to stop arrivals and people even before they reach these countries. Austria-Hungary and Serbia just made a partial agreement in October to support the defense of the Serbian border patrol, not in the Serbian-Hungarian border, in which case, of course, Belgrade was reluctant because they didn't want to be a parking lot for illegal migrants, but in the North Macedonian-Serbian border, which also interests for Serbia. And we saw similar agreements in 1.5 years between UK and France. But there are also examples from the US migration policy, for example, in this southern border plan between 2014-15, when the United States provided assistance for Mexico to strengthen border security in its southern border, literally the Mexican-Guatemalan border. How about the implementation? Perhaps it's the most interesting part and the part where you can debate perhaps most the theory. The EU and the member states has long history and tradition that the outside worlds arrive to Europe. We can mention the Huns, the Germans, Arabs, Hungarians, of course, Mongols, Ottoman, Russians. And we should mention also colonization, which established very strong connection between Europe and the neighboring world. So actually what is definitely on the table that in the strategic thinking of European policymakers, the cooperation with third countries, gatekeeper countries, even if they don't call them as gatekeeper countries, is always on the table. We can mention different examples. Nicolette will speak about Turkey, but just about the effectiveness of it. Currently now, ladies and gentlemen, there are 9 million immigrants in Egypt. And it's 3 million people plus if we compare the numbers before COVID-19 pandemic, which jeopardized a lot of economy, not only in the developed world, but also in the developing world. And still Egypt is ready to cooperate with the European Union and stop these people. In Libya, there are between 600,000 and 1.5 million. And they are not just keeping people there, but for example, the Moroccan Coast Guard is very active to stop people crossing. Just last year, 40,000 people was captured by the Moroccan Coast Guard on the sea, and they were brought back to the shores of Morocco. And if we compare the numbers, ladies and gentlemen, that, for example, the EU provides $500 million, a little bit more, development assistance to support the migration policy of Morocco. And if we compare that, hundreds of thousands of people for this money are stayed and kept in Morocco, perhaps it's not a very costly deal for us. What about the United States? This is my last slide. It's interesting to see, but in the whole strategic thinking and theoretical thinking of the United States, mass illegal migration is a relatively new challenge because it's emerged in the 80s. So if we compare these decades, the centuries of European Union, it's understandable why in some aspects Europe is much further in the solutions, even if sometimes we don't feel it. The ocean shield concept, and this is my experience in this, is still very strong in the strategic thinking of the United States. And there is limited geopolitical attention towards the South. It's changing in the last 10 years, but still the feeling that, the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean provides us a lot of defense, it's still in the mind. And as I mentioned, there are efforts mainly in the last decade to start to collaborate with these third countries. And we can mention also, the root causes issue. We'll see how it works, or the latest Darien agreement. But there's no any systematic consideration who help and support these gatekeeper countries. So a long-term solution and a mid-term solution is needed. Long-term strategies is needed. And both the EU and the United States should focus more on these gatekeeper countries and the win-win solution part of this story. So thank you very much, and finish now.